Welcome back to another episode of Canary Wharfian. Today we have Lawrence on. Lawrence, welcome on board.
Thank you, Nat. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to start with an overview and a background? Give us a little bit of sense for who you are, what you've done professionally.
Sure. So I went to boarding school in the UK and in Switzerland. I did my bachelor's in economics at the University of Sussex, and I switched to the University of Stanford in California. This was back 2014 to 2017, followed by a master's degree in St. Gallen. The course was the SIM course, the Strategy and International Management course, the flagship course of the University of St. Gallen, especially um, for students who are looking to break into consulting or private equity, commodities, those kinds of fields. And I finished that in July 2019 and joined Credit Suisse in Zurich in a wealth management function. After half a year, so in early 2020, I moved with Credit Suisse to London and joined the investment bank and spent 4 years at the investment bank at Credit Suisse, specifically within a wind down division. So what we were looking to do there is to reduce risk-weighted assets in the department, and generally get rid of, let's call it, unwanted business. I then moved once the UBS acquired Credit Suisse, once that merger announcement was made, to Accenture, the global consulting firm. I moved specifically there because I was told that, or I'd heard that they would be accompanying the integration efforts of the Credit Suisse business into the UBS framework. I spent around 2 years at Accenture. This was back in Zurich then, at the headquarters also of UBS and Credit Suisse, among other firms. And since April of last year, I left Accenture and joined a tiny consulting boutique called Ream Consulting in Zurich, specializing on financial services. And I am a project lead there and lead multiple mandates at once at the moment on specific financial services topics. So be it for Swiss banks as well as internationally, also for American bulge bracket banks and beyond.
Cool, man. Sounds like you've had a diverse experience. I picked up on a couple of things that I'm a little bit unclear on, uh, and I'd love to dive into it a little bit to get some clarity. You mentioned that you were working in the wind down division within Credit Suisse's investment bank. Can you walk us through what that is?
So the wind down division is what you'd colloquially know as the bad bank. So what happens is, as soon as the bank decides that certain parts of its portfolio, certain assets it holds on behalf of clients, for example, are unwanted, it tries to get rid of this. So every bank has a department like this. At Credit Suisse, it was first, I mean, they kept on renaming it as well. It was first the Asset Resolution Unit. I think there was even a name before that. Then it turned to be the Capital Release Unit. And at UBS, there's a similar name for it now. There's also a Deutsche Bank departments like that, et cetera, et cetera. And this can really be anything from, we have individuals at the bank who are holding accounts with money inside, or with assets, or with financing, or with mortgages, whatever it might be, and we don't really want their business. They might be politically exposed people. They might be people who have a criminal record and have that criminal record only since after they joined the bank, right? So when they joined the bank, everything was fine. The due diligence process went through, and since then they've had legal trouble. And it might also be just people who are subject to new risk frameworks that the bank implements, and they basically fall out of the accepted risk framework, and they need to be taken away. And the problematic is, in many cases, you can't just tell the client, okay, you're leaving the bank, we're sending you your money, and then goodbye, and then you send them their offboarding documents. In many cases, what's required is a lengthy process, also involving a legal action against these clients in order to get rid of the accounts, right? It might also be that you've got clients who you're trying to offboard, who might be, in prison, who might not be available. There might not be an address anymore that's valid, so post gets returned. You might not even be able to actually communicate to them that, hey, we would like to close your account, or we are closing your account. And then in many cases, the bank has to make a decision what to do with the money, the assets, or the liabilities that it holds on behalf of these clients. And if the clients can't be reached, what should be done with the money? So that's really what we were doing. So it was, let's just call it a one of the recipient ends of stuff that happens in the investment bank, and also actually from other divisions as well. So you could also have a wealth management client who could fall into the wind down division, and from asset management clients who could fall into that division. So it was always split. The team is quite big.
And you were quite junior at the time when you were working in this division?
So I started in August 2019. And I started as an analyst within global wealth management. I was focused on the monthly closing of a specific division. So that's not the accounting close, but it's the process that happens after, where you basically reconcile what the accounting department has decided, and you communicate that on to the investor relations team and investor communications team. So that might also flow into the annual report or quarterly report, so what be it. And after half a year, I then moved into that asset resolution unit department. And I was junior at the time. I was promoted relatively quickly. So I was promoted within a year or so. And that trend then continued throughout the years. I spent around 4 years exactly, I think, at Credit Suisse. And at the end, I was in a medium role. And of course, at the beginning, I joined as a junior.
Interesting. Can you walk us through a day in the life of working in the wind down division of Credit Suisse? And as you kind of walk us through this process, can you kind of highlight what the difference is between the wind down division and let's say other parts of the investment bank, such as equity capital markets, debt capital markets, and mergers and acquisitions?
Sure. I mean, so the work in that department is very project based. What you're trying to do is, you arrive in the office and you have I'm sharpening it a bit more compared to what it was in reality, but essentially you go into the office and you have a list of clients and a list of assets and projects that you're trying to close. And when I say close, you're trying to get rid of it, right? You're trying to reduce the risk-weighted assets associated with those respective accounts for the bank. You're trying to delete all the RWA. So the idea actually in those wind down divisions would be, if you're doing a perfect job, you'll lose it because there will be nothing to wind down anymore, right? Essentially, I have a certain amount of clients and cases that needed to be closed, and if all of those would be closed, the department wouldn't exist anymore, right? But of course, in practice, it doesn't really work like that because it's a constant inflow and outflow of cases. And essentially what we were doing is it's quite a big department, so there were specific focus areas. So there were also, as I mentioned, clients and assets that came in from other divisions. I was part of the investment banking division, assets that came in, and it's all very project based. So essentially the worry was that everything you would touch would turn into a legal case, and that's actually how it turned out to be in practice very often as well. So these were really lengthy projects where we were trying to, as I said, essentially reduce RWA, close these accounts, locate the respective clients, speak with the regulators, speak with the government of the country in which the client is located, and moving left and right. So it's not your classic investment banking job. It's rather, think of it more as a bit of an investigative department, to be honest. But of course, with that financial knowledge as the background, right, and as the fundament. And we were speaking with lawyers from the client side. We were speaking with regulators and with other government entities and negotiating with them what we will do with the assets that the bank holds and doesn't want to hold anymore, right? I'll give you an example. If there is, and I mentioned this example a moment ago as well, it could always happen that a client who is flagged in the bank as ultra high net worth or high net worth gets a criminal record or is at least investigated, right, under some criminal codes, and gets put in prison while that negotiation or while that investigation happens. The question then for the bank is, of course, what does the bank do with the money, right? So if the bank makes the decision to close down this client's accounts, what does the bank do? Does the bank send the money to the client's accounts? Maybe those accounts are frozen. Maybe the accounts and the money on those accounts is actually the source of the investigative trouble through the regulator that the client is having. So maybe that's not such a wise idea. Do we send it to the government then? Do we keep it? What do we actually do with the money? Can we work with it? Can we not work with it? So there's a lot of questions that popped up, and everything you touched was essentially a legal case and a very lengthy, at times a very lengthy and tricky process closing it down. It was project based. I would say it's not as intense as a trading role, for example. There's more of a strategic, long-term project-based approach. It's not, it's not the same intensity. So we would usually rock up at 8 a.m. And we would be out by 7 or 8 p.m. It was never really longer than that.
What about
And
the
the different,
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
and the difference between the wind down division and other departments, M&A or sell side, buy side, whatever it is, right? Functions in the investment bank. I mean, I've already circled around it. This is essentially a bit of a rubbish bin for the investment bank as well as for other divisions, where we discuss about how best to get rid of portfolios. So it's not general investment banking activity. So I would, although it is partly directly under the investment bank function, I wouldn't call it a direct investment banking job, because it isn't. So there's the difference, right? There's a total difference. We're not trying to make money for the bank with our activities. We're trying to reduce the legal exposure and the risk that the bank faces.
Is there a difference in compensation between wind down and the investment bank?
So the incentive structure is different, right? While the investment banks work quite heavily with bonus payments, the wind down divisions are, let's say, more standard in their approach. So classically, the bonus payments would be reduced, and the incentives in terms of reaching targets and reaching goals would obviously be set very differently. They're not set quite as quantitatively. I would say it depends a little bit on, of course, the position, and it depends on the location. It depends on what you do, right? If you're a rates trader and you're covering Swiss franc versus you're a rates trader and you're covering US dollars and you're sitting in the London office, not in the one in Frankfurt, there's going to be always monetary differences left and right. But in general, the investment banking function would have been paid probably a bit more, yes.
And what was your motivation for moving between wealth management to the wind down division?
So I was looking to work in a project-based environment. The wealth management division that I had joined at the beginning it felt for me like a bit of a dead end. So I was the youngest person by far. There were not really any other juniors, which I don't think is a good sign, because it just shows that there's not a lot of inflow and outflow of that department, of departments which show that. And the work itself was quite, I would say it was quite. There was not a lot of variation day to day, whereas in the capital release unit there was a lot of movement, right? And there was a lot of potential also to move up. So this is actually a key motivator for me at the time. I realized that there was significant opportunity there to move up the ranks and to learn a lot. It was also a lot about the learning curve, which after 6 months in the wealth management division, or even after like 4 months, I had already felt I sort of had reached near the end. And I ultimately just didn't see myself doing that for the next X years. So as part of the program which I joined, there was a new joiner program at Credit Suisse. You had the option of moving from one department to the other. Everyone was given that opportunity. You had to source any other opportunities yourself. And I had conversations, and I found out about the asset resolution unit at the time, and I thought that was really interesting, and so I moved.
Cool. And what kind of things were you doing in the wealth management role? Can you walk us through a day in the life in that department?
So that's obviously been a while now, right? That was back in 2019. what we were doing, as I mentioned, is the monthly closing procedure. So we received it was heavily based around a standardized process, which came about every month. So it was always we were looking at the fifth working day of the month, the eighth working day of the month, the 12th working day of the month. It was always a schedule, a fixed schedule. And what we were doing is we analyzed using cubes, which is an Excel add-on from Dodeca, quite a sophisticated tool for Excel standards at least. We were analyzing revenues, costs, profits, and all the other balance sheet relevant items from the wealth management division that have been coming in. So the good thing there was actually we got an extremely good overview of everything the bank does. And what the Cube add-on for Excel allowed me to do was basically to say, right, look, I'm gonna take a look at the bank and its direct revenues for, let's just say for March 2018. And then I can essentially double click on direct revenues and then I'll see one level lower, right? And then I can click and click and click and I can basically zoom in and zoom out and I can see where every single Swiss franc or every single US dollar or British pound is coming from for the bank, where the bank earns its money, from which client desk, from which client exactly, from which products that the client has bought. So I can really get an extremely good overview of the entire bank. So I think it wasn't a mistake. It was a good idea that I joined that division at the beginning. Probably, and I mean, to be transparent, every time you're interviewing for one of those positions and it's your first job, you don't really know what you're getting yourself into. At least I didn't at the time. So I always find those job descriptions to be somewhat ambiguous. Probably that's the point of them. So I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I think the time I spent in that division was useful because it gave me a good fundament. It gave me a solid opportunity to gain a really good understanding of how banks function, how they work, how they make money. So I think 6 months there was a really good time spent, and there the intensity was high during days where you had to actually do recon work and check if things add up. What we were really doing is a sanity check, right? So we were looking, if certain revenues or certain costs, even on a client basis, had absolutely jumped for 1 month from 1 month to the next, for example, we would look into that and we would search for it. So it was also investigative in that sense, but it was a sanity check, and we had certain deadlines to meet. So when we were working on certain days of the month, we had really intense periods where we were working sometimes even until midnight. And then on other days, we had not much to do, right? So there was always a bit of time, but that was fine because we all organized our holidays and our vacations and our days off accordingly, and ensured that the bank continues to handle that process smoothly on a monthly basis. So 6 months there was actually quite a good time, but I didn't want to spend more time there.
Nice. And then from what I understood, you moved to Accenture, correct?
That's correct.
And what were you doing at Accenture? You were working as a management consultant?
So Accenture has four different divisions. They have Accenture Technology, they have Accenture Strategy and Consulting, they have Accenture, I think it's Operations, and then they have another division. Sorry, I don't really remember exactly. What I did is I joined the classic Accenture Strategy and Consulting department. Within that, irritably, they have two different types of consultants. So they have the strategy arm and they have the management arm. The management arm, they get compensated slightly less, but they can usually charge for overtime. The strategy consultants are usually considered the more it's considered a bit of a higher tier, I guess. Probably certain people will have certain differing views on that, but they are generally paid higher, and then they can't charge for extra hours that they work. I went into the strategy department. It was the capital markets advisory. So again, within strategy and consulting, not only do they have the split between strategy consultants and management consultants, they also have specific divisions within that, right? So they had within strategy and consulting, financial services consulting. Then they had certain functions like CFO and EV. They had digital consulting focuses. They had banking focuses, capital markets focuses, etc., insurance focuses, etc., etc. And I joined the capital markets division, which was really focused on consulting for financial institutions. I joined them in Zurich, so we were looking at principally clients within the country, specifically within the city, really, of Zurich. And I joined as a senior consultant, a team lead in that division, and I spent around 2 years there, covered quite a few projects, also abroad actually, but mainly in Switzerland, and always consulting for big financial institutions.
And what specifically was your mandate for these clients typically, or was it a broad spectrum?
So it was quite a broad spectrum. What I generally favored was turnaround work, so distressed situations, crisis areas where projects aren't going well. So I made a name for myself as a firefighter, being put into positions where clarity and speed were demanded, and in situations where they weren't given at all. So when projects weren't going as planned, I was usually put in, and there was a really wide spectrum. So, if you're doing financial services work in Switzerland, in Zurich, there was only a handful of really big names, right? I mentioned UBS at the beginning. It's okay. I can say it again because it's public knowledge, right? So the UBS and Credit Suisse merger, one of the companies accompanying it was Accenture, and so I spent a lot of time on that mandate. I also worked with other banks as well, who I can't name. And the projects that I accompanied were different. I had some positions. I had some projects where I was not the team lead. I had some projects where I was the team lead, so I got a good breadth there as well. Generally speaking, there were a few projects that I was working on. So specifically, I started working on a target operating model, which the bank had decided on, that I was working for, and I spent 4 months on that. We were 5 people. What we did is we defined and implemented a target operating model for the client's Swiss booking center, and we addressed key post-merger integration topics for this client as well. So what we did is there was a large number of unidentified service gaps between the two banks. I mean, between Credit Suisse and UBS. We had to understand those service gaps. We had to make strategic decisions on what to do with those gaps, whether to close the gaps. The gaps could be anything from products, for example, right? UBS doesn't offer a miles and more credit card. Credit Suisse does. So what does UBS do? Should UBS also get miles and more credit card? Should it not? What's the danger of clients being so obsessed with that credit card that they would jump ship if UBS doesn't offer it? It sounds ridiculous, but there's things like that times a million that the bank had to consider. And at the time when I joined Accenture, that undertaking was still in its earliest stages. So there was a lot of decisions that needed to be made. There was a lot of analysis that needed to be made to actually find gaps in services and in products between the two banks. And what I did on that project is we delivered a structured target operating model for an operations department for the global wealth management division of that bank. And we also supported the initial adoption across the division. This is always something I like to highlight. So we're not just proposing something on nice glossy slides and then saying good luck implementing it. We accompanied the implementation to a certain extent. What I did afterwards is something completely different. Afterwards, I again looked at migration path planning for that bank, but specifically looked at ultra high net worth clients. So the idea was really we had to estimate the migration volumes and define migration strategies for Swiss-based wealth management customers. We had to understand how to migrate these clients. So we came up with 3 predefined migration paths for transitioning customers from the acquired bank to the acquirer, with clear objectives to maximize volumes for the easiest path. So we had to also understand products and product setups of those clients. Some of these clients had fantastically complicated product setups. So some of them had their own Swift networks, for example. So something which you can't just drag and drop through an IT migration. They had to be handheld and migrated that way. For other banks, I was also involved. So, for Or in Germany, for example, I was working for a big German asset management firm. For them, I defined and implemented a unified agile transformation strategy. We established targets and roadmaps for scaling agile practices across the firm. We did that as a team of 7 people, 3 months. That was super intense. So we worked Mondays to Fridays, sometimes Saturdays as well, but usually in Europe they stick to Mondays and Fridays if you're not in the investment bank. And we were working from 8 a.m. until 2 a.m. every day. So what you'd expect from an MDB style role. That was a very intense project. I was working on a fund integration project as well for another bank. So we were migrating asset management funds, 90 of them, over 100 billion Swiss francs assets under custody, with over 70,000 underlyings, 25 tons of gold, etc. Across 50 markets. We were transferring those funds between 2 divisions, and we were doing so under extremely tight regulatory timelines. So it's really been quite a broad project experience that I've managed to collect. I can give you one last example. I can also say that I was working on employee equity programs. So there was also a case where a client had to completely revamp its employee equity program. We had to completely set that up. Knew we had to work with external vendors to see what product offering would be the best. We had to actually implement it with the client, test it, program it. And there, for example, I was pulled in as an emergency fixer. There were 6 streams in that division, some of them on reporting on amber, most of them reporting on red. So I'm talking about the RAG status, RAG. And we were tasked to bring delivery back on track, own the entire project to a certain degree, and get things back on track. And that was, again, a very intense time. So it depends, right? You can have quite relaxed projects and you can have pretty intense projects.
So you mentioned that you worked on a lot of your mandates were driven by distress situations. How do you define
Yeah.
how do you define distress? Is it financial? Is it operational? And then how did that inform the mandates that you worked on? Was it a lot of financial analysis and trying to figure out how to do restructurings?
So
And then
I've usually worked in an operations facing role. So when I talk about distress situations, I don't talk about the classic financial distress. I talk about operationally. We at our current company brand ourselves as transformation and turnaround experts, and we're heavily involved with back office functions. So if we are seeing that a project isn't meeting predefined, pre-agreed deadlines, timelines, and isn't keeping up to pace, that project slips, and then that project risks other deliverables within the bank. Right? The bank or any other financial institution that we work for sets specific budgets for certain undertakings, and if that budget runs out, then it's a huge problem for the bank to allocate additional budget to certain projects. If the result is that, okay, the people who were tasked with doing it just didn't do it to an agreed standard. So we define it usually as operational risk.
gotcha. A lot of the listeners that are listening to us now are young students who are deciding where to set their trajectory with respect to their career. Can you talk to us a little bit about the cultural differences you noticed between banking and consulting? And also, I guess, how that relates to pay expectations between banking and consulting?
So it differs vastly according to geography. You can be a consultant at McKinsey in Milan and you can earn less than half of what a junior analyst earns at Accenture in Zurich within consulting, and the same will be true. Well, actually, it won't be that much the case in investment banking, but in consulting, definitely a geographic difference makes all the difference. In investment banking, to a certain degree, it's more standardized. The best place for earning a lot of money if you're interested in an investment banking career is to be in the United States. That is clear. there also the golden times are not what they, they're gone. It's not what it used to be. That's everywhere the case. But if you look at starting comp for an analyst at JPMC or MS, it will be significantly higher than the salary he can expect in London or even in smaller places, right? I think the geographical location really makes a difference also for the investment bank. Maybe not so much in terms of pay, but in terms of opportunities. So if you look, for example, at the investment banks that are working here in Switzerland. So in Zurich, for example, a lot of it is very premature, very small. I don't know if you've got rates trading, you're usually doing Swiss franc coverage, and that's pretty much it. You might be doing a little bit of M&A left and right, but it's not it's not even in the same it's not in the same century as what they're doing in London, right? So in London, there's a lot more pace, a lot more going on. It's a lot more how you'd actually think investment banking, for example, worked. What I think moving between the two industries is fine. That is possible, right? Left or right. It's probably easier to move from an investment banking role into consulting than the other way around. Simply, that's just my experience. That's how I found it. So I didn't really have trouble leaving the investment bank and going into consulting. But I figure that if I would now go back into the investment bank, I would probably struggle with that simply because, you know, employers are spoiled for choice in the last few years. So they will always take the one person whose CV and background fits one to one. So you're always better off moving from investment banking into consulting if that's what you want to do. Working in consulting compared to working in investment banking is vastly different. So it depends obviously on what you do exactly in the investment bank, but the incentives are different. The politics is very different. And the pay is also different, right? So in consulting, usually you have more of a higher fixed salary, but you have a significantly smaller bonus. That is usually the case. That is the case across MBB, the Big Four, Accenture, Simon Kucher, whatever it is. That's the case pretty much everywhere. There are definitely a few boutique exceptions, but if you are looking for a really high bonus, then investment banking in a good year is your best bet. For that, obviously, you will, unless you're at MBB, be working more in the investment bank or at least to a higher intensity. At MBB, you will also be working a lot. In most of the other consulting firms, they tend to have a bit more of a humane approach. Again, there it varies on the location. So in London, the colleagues will likely, be a bit more busy, or in Frankfurt than they will be in Lugano, for example, right? So it's all about geography.
And what about the lifestyle differences between banking and consulting
Lifestyle in what sense?
in terms of how many hours you have to work?
So again, it depends on the firm. It depends on the project. I would say that at McKinsey, BCG, and Bain, they really make you bleed. So they take juniors in and really work them. I had the opportunity to join McKinsey back in 2019 when I actually then went for Credit Suisse. I did that out of two reasons. I wanted to be in Switzerland specifically at the beginning. I thought that was a good thing to do. McKinsey would have been in Munich. And at the same time, what scared me is going into McKinsey as an absolute junior. I think it would have been the associate role or the analyst role. I don't quite remember how McKinsey does it. I had heard a lot about them, really working their juniors on obviously the grunt work, right? The analyses probably actually not so much, but especially the sort of the PowerPoints and the decks, everything that you'd expect, right? That's what they're really known for. So you're working really intensely at MBB. There is time on the bench, or McKinsey calls it the beach, which is the intra project time. So when you're finishing one project and you're moving to the next project, usually there's a few weeks to even a few months of lead time in between where usually you're doing sales or other activities. At MBB, they then actually do leave you alone a little bit more because you actually need to recover. In the investment bank, it obviously varies as well, right? If you're working on M&A deals, it will be less regularly intense than if you're a trader, right? So if you're a trader, you don't have your phone on the floor, you are completely locked in, you get lunch brought to your desk, you're sitting there from the moment you arrive to the moment you leave, you're getting shouted at by your colleagues and your boss. It's a different vibe than those people doing M&A, for example. Not saying that they don't work as hard. I'm just saying there's a different expectation. The business moves at a bit of a different pace. There are different requirements, right? If you're looking at an M&A deal, if you're calculating an LBO, right, and you're looking at options there, it's a collaborative process. It's, I would also say, more project based. Definitely is project based, while uh, classic investment banking, the way you would imagine it from Wolf of Wall Street or from the movies Wall Street, are that's obviously quite intense and very different.
Yeah, that's clear. You mentioned earlier about the golden times of investment banking and that they're gone. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What did they look like while they were there, and what do times look like now?
Well, I didn't actually witness the golden times. So, I mean, it's something that everyone always talks about and sort of reminisces about. What it means is multiple things, right? If you look at the Swiss market, for example, it could be the old Swiss banking secrecy laws, which proved very fruitful for Swiss banks because they were able to, make vast sums of money of clients that had deposited assets within their banks. That has disappeared. A lot of lobbying has gone from the US to make that disappear. So by now, that is eroded. What it essentially means is a more unregulated industry. So the investment banks, specifically in the US, in the early 2000s and the late 90s, they weren't subject to as many regulatory requirements as banks are at the moment, right? There is a lot of pressure on investment banks to manage their risks. Look again at what happened to Credit Suisse. The investment bank was one of the core losers of the bank, right? They brought the bank into turmoil through Archegos and through many other scandals that had happened. At the end, it was um, a reputational problem the bank had, not a capex or a balance sheet problem, but nonetheless, the investment bank contributed a lot to that. UBS right now is under extreme pressure to speak with the Swiss government about their capital requirements. The Swiss government, as a safety precaution after the fall of Credit Suisse, wants to implement essentially ludicrously high capital adequacy ratios and capital measures for the bank, completely eroding their international competitiveness. So there is a lot more scrutiny. There is a lot more. We do things by the book, and we do things carefully, and there is not as much opportunity anymore to make windfall gains as there was in the early 2000s and in the 90s and preceding that time. And that will never come back, right? So investment banks will stay under scrutiny. The ones that do it well do well. The ones that don't do well won't do well, and it's a bit of a knock-on effect. So if you don't do well for a number of years, you're going to erode confidence in investors' minds, and then you're going to lose out. So at the end of the day, it's also a trust and confidence thing, more so now than ever before.
Cool. Let's move on. You mentioned that you are either now working at Ream or you were working at Ream. Can you tell us a little bit about Ream as a firm and what you're up to
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, so no one will know what Ream is. Ream Consulting is the current company that I work for. I went from Accenture with 830,000 employees to a boutique with 10 employees. So we are, as boutique as it gets. Let's call it that. Um, I can tell you about the reason why I made that change if you're interested as well. I spent 2 years nearly at Accenture. There was a lot of politics involved, as is the case with any big organization. I left simply due to internal reasons. So, Accenture was messing around with the bonus periods, with promotion cycles. They were pulling out all the stops and playing tricks on the employees to try and gain some more momentum and to basically keep them in the position they are. So they were basically trying to not pay out large bonuses, not promote on time. So they were, I saw this with the colleagues in my division, that they were being, promised promotions, and these promotions were partly overdue by a long way. And I looked at that situation and thought, okay, it's probably not the environment I'd like to be in, as I recognized it not to be an environment of quality or of achievement, but rather an environment of time. So essentially, what I'm saying is, you've got me here, and you've got you. We're two colleagues now working at Accenture. If you joined 2 months before I did, you're going to get promoted before I will. And that's just the point. It doesn't matter if you turn up at 10 and leave at 4, and I do 12-hour shifts every day and I go the extra mile. You're going to get promoted before me because you arrived there before me. And it's sort of that whole decision-making process that company and all the other companies in that area, maybe not MBB, but definitely the big four, definitely Oliver Wyman and the other big sort of consulting firms apply, that I just thought isn't really for me. It's not competitive. It's rather, okay, we're going to retain the employees who are most loyal to us, and I just don't think that's the way it works. I much rather prefer an environment which credits you for the achievements you make, rather than for your blind loyalty to the firm. So I made the decision to leave that that consulting firm in early 2025, and I joined as I mentioned, a tiny consulting boutique here in Zurich called Ream Consulting. So we're 10 people. We focus on, again, distressed situations, turnaround and transformation topics for the financial services industry. We also have a reach beyond that. So we also work with the German industry, which is, can be anything from agricultural produce to engines and whatever it is. But our main foothold is always financial work. So we're never going to tell anyone how to better their supply chain, or how to remake their factory floors to make them 10% more efficient. We're always looking at balance sheet, financial topics, and always looking at companies, or generally most naturally looking at companies that are in distress. So the work at the company at the moment is very different in the sense that there's a much more collaborative environment. We are so small that we need to work together. The difference is also, you're not really a number anymore, as you are in those big companies. If Accenture has a few thousand people they can staff on a single project, you are essentially a number, and as soon as you roll off, they can staff someone else within a minute. This is obviously not the case as such a small firm. Also, client facing, it's not the company that counts, but the people. So you're not remembered as being someone from Accenture or someone from Ream. You're known as Loritz, and as Martin, and as Alex, known as the people who actually work there. So and there's a lot of advantages to that. It means that clients recognize you, not the company behind you. You get a lot more senior exposure, simply because there's no senior manager, director, or managing director to take away those senior contacts from you, which is the case at those big companies, right? Because they want to meet their sales targets, and sales targets aren't existent for lower rank or medium rank consultants. And it's just generally an environment. So we have one managing partner, the owner of the company, who everything goes through him, and he sets a course, and he decides. There's no politics that is being hidden and played out behind back. It is straight up. There is a decision chain. He has the final word. He decides where the company goes, and everyone is welcome to contribute. Also, our bonus structures and promotion structures are more heavily fixed on sales than they are, at Accenture, for example, because while Accenture is on pretty much every RFP list, Ream is on exactly zero, which is natural because we're so small. So we have to actually actively hunt down new engagements and new projects, and everyone is invited to do that, from the most junior analysts to the managing partner. We're all involved in extending current engagements where they make sense, in obtaining new projects. And that's a very big difference to the established firms. So what I'm essentially saying is, if you're in consulting and you want an entrepreneurial setting and you wish to really learn what it takes to pull up or to really drive a business from zero to something, then join a boutique, because you're going to experience a bit of a startup environment internally while you are presenting yourself to the client as an extreme professional, same as a McKinsey consultant would.
Lawrence, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left here, and I'd like to use that time to talk about the hype around AI. How do you see AI affecting what you're doing in your role at Ream? Are you using it a lot? Do you see any danger with respect to it replacing consultants or bankers? Can you just share a bit of thoughts around AI, its role in what you're doing, and um, as a closing note?
So what I'm seeing a lot is that clients are interested in AI and they are willing to adopt AI, but the specific use cases aren't quite clear. And the reason for that could be that the technology is not reliable enough yet, or at least the applications that build on this technology are not reliable yet, that internal legacy risk systems and control systems actually prohibit the usage of these products. So, at some of these big banks, the internet is obviously heavily filtered. You can't just enter any website you want, and also, the idea of working at JP Morgan Chase and entering client data into ChatGPT, just that's obviously a no-go. So lots of these clients are also developing their own intranet versions or safe to use versions of AI chatbots, so LLMs. And I think there's a lot of usage on those for emails, for general research, for creating decks, for getting a second view on things. I think there's a lot of value to be taken there. I see artificial intelligence as a threat to consulting. I absolutely do. I think that a lot of the junior roles, a lot of the grunt work, so I mentioned earlier on, right, I didn't want to go to McKinsey back in 2019 because they really make you bleed as a junior. A lot of that work will at some point be automated by artificial intelligence. There's a lot of startups already working on, consultant as a service types of applications. I think a lot of that will be replaced. I think a lot of the work that consulting entails, which is, you do PowerPoint, you do Excel, you do analysis, you do pivot tables and VLOOKUPs, and you gain an understanding of what really is going on here. An AI can do that in a minute, and there are really, really cool AI startups that are ChatGPT or Gemini wrappers who focus on data collection, right, from Excels and Tableau and Power BI and whatever it is, and can spit out results in a minute and go on from there. So I really see a threat to consulting, and the consulting industry will have to change if it wants to stay relevant. I think so much is clear. I don't think it will affect the most senior roles. I think consulting will definitely survive the AI, let's call it revolution, right, to a certain degree, but it will result in smaller teams, more focused on issues that are qualitative, not quantitative, and it will completely revamp the pricing model for consultants. So it will be less. We'll charge you by the hour, and it will be more. We'll pay you on results. So it will have a fundamental impact on banks generally. Look, I mean, there are certain areas within banking that will absolutely feel the effect. So it can be anything from anti-money laundering to onboarding to compliance topics, for example, that are already being transformed by advances in artificial intelligence technology. And I think that will continue. But the future, especially for consulting, will change a lot. Every industry will be impacted, but consulting will feel it quickly and intensely.
Lawrence, it was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.